Nativism in America by Bailey Slager. For years, America welcomed immigrants from all over the world. The United States offered the promise of jobs, safety, and for some, a fresh start. Although the presentation of our open door policy was positive, many times the reception of these foreign populations was less than warm. Many factors of the time period played a major role in how certain populations were received into American society. Unfortunately, for many of these groups, the cause of their alienation was the result of a society ruled by nativism. Today we are facing such a circumstance. The recent events in Paris, France, and Brussels, Germany, have made many Americans wary of immigrants from the Middle East, and the large influx of Syrian refugees has brought this issue to the forefront. A new act was presented to Congress in 2015 that called for stricter regulations in the immigration process. According to the Library of Congress, the new act, known as the American Security Against Foreign Enemies Act, or SAFE Act, would require that supplemental certifications and background investigations be completed prior to the admission of certain aliens as refugees. The people under speculation in this act include any alien applying for admission to the United States as a refugee who is a national resident or a resident of Iraq or Syria, has no nationality and whose last habitual residence was in Iraq or Syria, or has been present in Iraq or Syria at any time on or after March 1st, 2011. In other words, until a covered alien's background check has been approved by the Department of Homeland Security, Federal Bureau of Investigations, and the Director of National Intelligence, they cannot be submitted into the immigration process. The current system already delays entry approximately 1.5 to 2 years. Passing this act to ensure extra security would ultimately halt the immigration system until the new immigration measures were created. The SAFE Act has been dubbed by one representative as a knee-jerk reaction to a situation in Europe that is entirely dissimilar to our refugee admissions process. Is this truly an impulsive reaction to fear, or are we just taking our national security into account? As I mentioned before, America's history is filled with instances in which we excluded a group of people for one reason or another. We can look back now and analyze the causes of xenophobia expressed by the American people and label them as irrational or silly, although at the time the situations probably seemed realistic. Perhaps if we compare the Middle Eastern immigration situation with these circumstances of the past, we can objectively judge whether or not our reactions today are truly justified or just a product of societal and worldly values that are causing history to repeat itself. I have chosen 3 instances throughout history to compare to the situation we are facing today. I will begin with the Irish immigrants during the 1800s. Although the Irish had been immigrating to America prior to 1840, the issues did not arise until their population began to grow to an enormous size as a result of the Irish potato famine. Their large populations in the cities began making many nervous. Since there were so many Irish, it did not seem like they were assimilating to the American culture. Instead, they seemed to remain foreigners. According to Bruce M. Stave's article, Coming to Connecticut, Immigrants in the Land of Unsteady Habits, he mentions that by 1860, Connecticut's foreign-born population was 80,696, or 17.5% of the state's population. The Irish made up 55,445 of that number, or 69%, which was also 12% of the entire state. This time period was known as the Industrial Revolution, and many factory jobs sought out those who would work for the lowest pay. Many Irish ended up working in these factories because they would work any job that they could get. When the economy went bad and unemployment rose, the Irish were seen as a threat because they created competition in the job market. Also, most of the Irish immigrants who came to America were poor, unskilled workers, and they were forced to live wherever they could afford, which in many cases meant living in horrible conditions. Many immigrants in New York City and other big cities lived in tenements. Because the Irish population was so great and there was a dire need for housing, the tenements were usually packed double the amount of people they could hold. The tenements had no running water, no plumbing, and the only ventilation was one window located in the main room of the apartment. Buildings would usually share outhouses or privies that were located behind the tenements. When Irish immigrants would arrive in America, they would bring in a multitude of diseases that they had contracted from traveling in such close quarters. These diseases only worsened with overcrowded living in tenements and tended to spread throughout the whole building. Because of poor sanitation and leaky privy vaults contaminating their main water sources, it was almost impossible for them to get out of the path of illness. As a result, the Irish were associated with disease. Disease was in turn associated with poverty, and unfortunately, Irish immigrants were unable to receive appropriate medical attention. At this time in America, one's success was based on an individual's own choices. Basically, society felt like it was the poor's fault that they were poor. At the time, sanitation and living conditions were obviously not taken into account as to why the Irish were facing epidemics and extreme poverty. Society blamed poverty on the Irish ethnicity. According to Stephen A. Brighton's article, Degrees of Alienation, a person's lifestyle, religion, ethnicity, and class were believed to be the factors that caused illness. Brighton also states that the Irish were seen as a threat to the health and security of the American way of life. Since the Irish were supposedly choosing to live the way they were excluded from receiving medical attention. One study done on medicinal bottles recovered from the Five Points in New York and the Dublin section of Paterson, New Jersey, suggests that the Irish were excluded from receiving medical treatment, possibly because the stigma that had been placed on them. The number of ethical versus proprietary medicine recovered from Irish immigrant, Irish American, Protestant American, and German American households proved the limited access the Irish had to appropriate medical care. Many Irish immigrants were turned away from doctors due to their unworthy lifestyles and to look for medicine elsewhere. Many got medicine from charities when they could, but even then some were turned down because of their unworthiness. Not only were Americans suspicious of the Irish immigrants because of their large number or ethnic diseases, but they were also suspicious because the Irish were Catholic. Americans at this time were a majority Protestant, and the idea of being loyal to the Pope, who was located in another country, did not sit well with many Americans. Some newspapers even went as far as printing articles about a possible papal plot to overthrow all non-Catholic governments in Europe and the United States. When St. Peter's, the first Catholic church in New York, was built, a group of Protestant Americans burned it down. Also, in 1834, an American mob set fire to a convent of mostly Irish sisters in Charlestown, Massachusetts. There were many actions taken against the vast Irish population that resided in the United States. One response to this influx of Irish immigrants was the formation of the Nativist American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party. This political party reached its zenith in the mid-1850s, running on the platform of requiring a 21-year residence in order to obtain citizenship, and also the exclusion of Catholics and immigrants from holding public office. In Connecticut, the group of all-white Protestant males successfully elected William T. Minor as governor in 1855, and Minor managed to get rid of all militia composed of foreign-born. The alienation that the Irish faced was primarily due to their ethnicity, religion, and social class. The religion factor that prevented American acceptance of Irish immigrants correlates with the anti-Islamic sentiments that are expressed today. Also, the stigma placed on the Irish's ethnicity prevented many from receiving appropriate medical attention. The terrorist acts that have happened over the past few years have resulted in negative stigmas being placed on Middle Eastern immigrants as well. The second example I want to look at is Japanese relocation and internment during World War II. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed an American naval base at Pearl Harbor. This came as a complete shock to Americans, especially since they were currently negotiating peaceful terms with Japanese leaders. As a result, many Americans were afraid of a possible Japanese invasion, and mistrust of the Japanese population surfaced. Many Japanese lived around the West Coast, and their populations were concentrated around military and civilian sites. According to the relocation and internment of people of Japanese descent, there were 150,000 people of Japanese descent living in Hawaii and about 112,000 living on the west coast, which was 88.5% of the total people of Japanese descent living in the mainland U.S. Suspicion of the Japanese population rose after reports of signaling off the west coast between the Japanese Americans and the enemy ships surfaced. This rumor, along with the fact that many Japanese had dual citizenship and had gotten their education in Japan, made many people uneasy. Acting on the claim that there was not enough time to determine which Japanese were loyal and which were not, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Executive Order No. 9066, which called for the relocation and internment of all Japanese citizens living in these concentrated areas. Here is a clip from a video released by the War Relocations Authority.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move. This picture tells how the mass migration was accomplished. Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should. There were more Japanese in Los Angeles than in any other area. At nearby San Pedro, houses and hotels occupied almost exclusively by Japanese were within a stone's throw of a naval air base, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. But of course, this limited evacuation was a solution to only part of the problem. The larger problem, the uncertainty of what would happen among these people in case of a Japanese invasion, still remained. That is why the commanding general of the Western Defense Command determined that all Japanese within the coastal area should move inland.
In this order, the Japanese were excluded from certain areas of the U.S., including California, parts of Oregon, and Washington, and certain parts of Arizona. According to the article, around 110,000 people of Japanese descent were relocated. Many claimed that the relocation and internment was unconstitutional and could not be carried out, but these cases did not stand against the dire state of the national security. It appeared that the government could carry out whatever measures seemed necessary to protect the country, even if it was unconstitutional. Those who were interned lost $2.7 billion worth of property, which was $200 million in 1943. Eventually, the government did finally recognize the wrongs that it committed against the people of Japanese descent, and several acts were passed to retain face. It is clear that wartime hysteria had a major impact on the reactions by U.S. citizens and government against the people of Japanese descent. Although most were loyal to the United States, fear of possible invasion heightened suspicions and led to the grouping of all people with ties to ethnicity of an enemy that attacked America. This directly reflects the situation we find ourselves in today. Although terrorist attacks are only done by radicals, we classify all Muslims as radicals and attach a negative stigma to their ethnicity and religion. The last example in history that I want to compare to Middle Eastern immigration of today is McCarthyism during the Cold War. The tension that existed within the years of the Cold War came to a peak in 1950 during the Korean War. According to Ellen Schrecker's article, McCarthyism, Political Repression, and the Fear of Communism, the federal government was the crucial actor. The United States government was so afraid that the Soviet Union was going to establish communist governments in every country that it would spread until eventually the United States would be forced to become communist as well. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was established to root out potential communist sympathizers and spies. Citizens began to be blacklisted right and left on grounds of association with the Communist political party. Some were even accused by others and were never given information about why. According to Schrecker, the Truman administration's loyalty security program made it possible to fire people outright. If they were accused of being or sympathizing with communists, they could be fired without any legitimate evidence. This was very problematic, and many citizens lost their jobs due to this communist witch hunt. Scheckler also mentions another act called the Internal Security Act of 1950 that called for all members of the Communist Party to be registered along with any organizations that associated with it. The manufactured threat of communism to the United States fueled anxiety in every corner of the country. People were suspicious of one another and no one was safe from accusations. Some of these suspicions led to people thinking that Communist Party members and pharmaceutical companies could adulterate the drugs they were manufacturing. Communist broadcasters could fill the airwaves with propaganda. Even teachers were suspects. Many people were affected by this hysteria, but two famous cases were the Rosenbergs and Alger Hiss. In 1951, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were convicted of giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. They were both sentenced to death by electric chair and were executed in 1953. Alger Hiss was accused by Whittaker Chambers while he was on trial. Chambers accused Hiss of serving as a spy for the Soviet Union while he was working as a high-ranking State Department official. He was convicted and served 44 years in prison. The wartime hysteria that resonated throughout the Cold War era led to many irrational acts towards those deemed as suspects. People who associated with those America was at war with were targeted as automatic enemies and alienated from society. The factors of fear and war correlate with the attitudes we have today toward immigrants from the Middle East. Fear of terrorist attacks from within our country's borders are a major factor for the negativity placed on the Middle Eastern immigrants. Just as the U.S. feared an internal communist takeover, we fear an internal terrorist takeover. Unfavorable views toward the Islamic religion of today parallel those that were expressed toward Catholicism during the 1800s. It is clear through this relationship that religion, as a factor of alienation, is being repeated. Also, the negative stigma placed on the ethnicities of immigrants from the Middle East directly reflect the critical views that Americans had about the Irish. Not only do religious and ethnic elements influence our attitudes towards those from the Middle East, but also their association with a foreign enemy. After 9/11, our society became anti-Muslim. Soon, it was not just radicals who were involved in terrorist attacks, it was all people from that area of the world. Americans have grouped these people together based on the actions of a small percentage. This sounds like a lot like the situation following the Pearl Harbor bombing during World War II. The actions of certain Japanese people caused the suspicion of all Japanese people, and they were forced to relocate and remain in holding areas until the war was over. Association of Muslims with the enemy also reflects the anxiety that rumbled throughout the Cold War era. American fear of another terrorist attack after Paris and Brussels has heightened suspicion, just as citizens were suspicious of internal communist spies. The Islamic terrorist group ISIS has been recruiting people from all over and claims to hold allegiance with many inside the United States. There is no way to know who is an ISIS sympathizer, and this concept is fostering a lot of anxiety within American society. So the questions are raised. Are we expressing such unfavorable attitudes toward immigrants from the Middle East because they have a religion that is uncommon to the majority, just as the Irish did? Are we placing a negative stigma on this population because their ethnicity is associated with the enemy, just as the Japanese were? Is our fear producing anxiety that is leading us to suspect and think things that are irrational? The SAFE Act that called for further security checks on aliens entering the United States got many responses that address these questions. In a couple of responses about the SAFE Act appearing in the Congressional Digest, several representatives expressed their views on the matter. United States Republican Representative Doug Collins states that the Islamic State will use any means possible to bring America to her knees, that we are a nation with a fundamental responsibility to preserve the right of our citizens. Collins also states that the SAFE Act is simply adding a certification step, but it is about keeping out those who pose a threat to our national security. Another Republican representative, Michael McCall, claims that Islamic terrorists are seeking to harm our people, destroy our way of life, and undermine the foundational principles of the free world. It seems that both Collins and McCall are expressing the same attitudes found in both World War II and the Cold War. These decisions are simply all in the name of national security. However, United States Democratic Representative Zoe Lofgren calls this a bad idea and states that the fight against ISIS is a fight of values. Another Democratic representative, John Conyers, also agrees with Lofgren. He calls the act flawed and inhumane, and we would be slamming our doors to the world's most vulnerable. Conyers also calls the act an overreaction because the security measures we already have in place are fine. Representative Benny Thompson refers to our admission system as rigorous, robust, and extensive. Thompson also calls for everyone to embrace facts over fear. After reading the opinions of these and other representatives about the SAFE Act, it is clear that the parties are divided. All of the Republican representatives in this collection support the act because the protection of the American people comes first. The Democratic representatives seem to feel the very opposite. They do recognize that the protection of the American people is important, but that it is our country's duty to provide protection to refugees from Syria and Iraq. They claim that halting the admissions process in order to install further security would only hurt instead of help. Although the stigma is placed on most all populations from the Middle East, the large amount of refugees fleeing Syria is what stirred up the controversy. According to the refugee admission and assimilation process for the 2016 fiscal year, the Obama administration announced that the United States would admit at least 10,000 Syrian refugees as the allocation for the Near East South Asia region, which is 34,000. From October 1, 2010 through October 31, 2015, the U.S. admitted a total of 2,070 Syrian refugees. Compared to Europe, the United States has barely allowed any Syrians to immigrate. According to this statistic from the New York Times, from 2012 to September 2015, the United States has only admitted 1,854 Syrian refugees, while Germany has admitted 92,991. That is a large difference.